Major COVID outbreak that overwhelmed the remote Bearskin Lake First Nation in Northern Ontario has cast a real spotlight on emergency help for First Nations right across Canada. Critics say response times for getting to those Indigenous communities in times of crisis are far too slow, and they're calling for an urgent rethink in policy. Logan Turner is with us this morning. He's been reporting on this whole issue, and good to see you, Logan, as we look to this issue more broadly. Tell us about some of the government responses. We've reported on Indigenous communities asking for help. How have governments responded to those requests?
Right. Well, Heather, the Assembly of First Nations recently has said that First Nations are 18 times more likely to be evacuated due to a natural disaster as opposed to non-Indigenous or non-First Nations communities. And, with climate change, we're expecting to see those natural disasters, be they fires, floods, pandemics, become more frequent and more intense. And certainly just in the last year or 2 years, First Nations have been affected especially hard. You mentioned Bearskin Lake in northwestern Ontario, where half of the population was, infected with COVID-19, even more forced to isolate. And the response from the government was very much criticized as too little, too late. In the BC floods, just this past few months, a lot of First Nations felt like they were an afterthought when it came to the response from the government. And then I think as well, of the spring breakup last spring in the Northwest Territories, there was the village Fort Simpson, which is also home to the Lidley First Nation. There was floods that forced hundreds to flee their homes. But when the mayor of the village had called for help, the military was only able, and the government was only able to send in 2 Canadian Rangers, both of whom were from Fort Simpson and were, struggling to deal with their own families and homes that were affected by the flood. So what several experts have told me is that this has led to this culture where First Nations and Indigenous communities expect that when natural disasters happen, when they're in crisis, they're expecting that the government won't respond quickly enough or adequately enough.
And do those experts have any idea why that is, why the responses aren't happening as quickly as the community leaders would like?
Right. Well, really, Heather, in so many different reports, whether they're academic sources or government reports or just experts that I spoke to in the past week, what they say or what they point to is this jurisdictional complexity, this, this question of whose responsibility is it to respond? Is it the province or territory, or is it the federal government? And what reports have been quite clear about is that, provinces and territories have the responsibility to respond to any, natural disasters or emergencies within their territory, and the federal government, especially Indigenous Services Canada, they're responsible for providing advice and for providing reimbursements for some of those costs. And then, of course, when there's a formal request for military assistance, then they do that. But so what that means with this jurisdictional complexity is that there's confusion, frustration, and often a failure to respond to Indigenous communities. But there are, really a couple of things that can be done that are repeated by many experts and these reports. Some of those things being clarifying what those roles could be, by signing these tripartite agreements between First Nations as well as the provinces and Ottawa. Adequate funding and resources can be provided to Indigenous communities so they can do these, they can prepare for themselves. They can, complete those emergency preparedness plans and practice them. You can include local traditional knowledge in the planning, as well as addressing legacy infrastructure deficits and having those conversations with First Nations, about what resources need to be protected. And so these are just a few of the things that are repeated by many experts and many reports, including those written by the government.
And now, what is Ottawa doing to address the situation, Logan?
Right. Well, there's a graph that you'll see in a moment that shows the emergency management program that Indigenous Services Canada that they use. There it is. And so this shows that kind of in the last decade, especially with the exception of the 2011-2012 year, the amount of money that's being spent to help Indigenous communities, prepare, mitigate for these natural disasters, it's been gradually increasing up to the last few years. But I also spoke with Canada's Indigenous Services Minister, Patty Hajdu, and she has acknowledged the frustration that many Indigenous communities have with the government. She's called that, a legacy of colonialism, and she has acknowledged that there is a lot of work that remains to happen to help, Indigenous communities feel more prepared to respond to natural disasters and other emergencies. And she has said that for her, it's a priority.
It is definitely a priority of mine as the Minister of Indigenous Services to pull together better collaboration with provinces and territories, not just in this space, but in every space that impacts and affects Indigenous people.
And so Ottawa says, Heather, it's doing this work, it's trying to do this work, it's trying to fill these gaps, but whether or not that work will be enough, we'll have to judge by the way that Canada responds to future emergencies.
Logan Turner in Thunder Bay, thank you very much for the reporting this morning. I appreciate it, Logan.